In this video, I'll be talking about a technique of observational drawing that will allow you to draw what you see more realistically. In fact, I don't know of any other drawing technique that will build your skills of drawing realistically as quickly and as effectively as this one, and it might be a technique that you're already familiar with. It's called the grid method, and if you learn nothing else in a drawing course, at least learn how to use this method. The grid method is often found among drawing activities for small children, but really this is a technique that has been used by professional artists for literally thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians used it, the Renaissance artists used it. It's a way of keeping your drawings proportionate to what you're seeing. The idea is pretty simple. Put a grid of horizontal and vertical lines over the image that you want to copy, which is called your reference. Then make a grid on a blank paper or canvas, then use the grid lines as guides to match up the proportions of your reference to your drawing, or follow the reference by copying the shapes one square at a time. Not only does this method help you to draw realistically by giving you reference points to align your drawing to, but it also helps to tap into that part of your brain that allows you to see and draw realistically by giving you a new way of seeing things. We'll start by placing a grid on our reference image. There are several ways that you can do this. The most common is to draw a grid right on top of the reference. You would do this by measuring out even spaces along the top, bottom, and side edges of the paper. Then connect those marks to make a grid. I'll show you a little bit more in detail how to do this later in the video. I personally don't like to do it this way because it can cover up some key details in an image and it can destroy the image. So you wouldn't ever want to do this on a picture that you would want to keep in good condition. Plus, if you draw lines incorrectly, even if you draw in pencil, you may not be able to erase them. I personally like to make grids on transparent overlays. You can make one by drawing a grid on a blank piece of paper and then photocopying it onto a photocopy safe transparency. If you have a digital image, you can upload it to a site or an app that will place a grid on it for you. You can even do this on your phone, or place the grid over a digital picture in an image editing program. When placing a grid over the reference image, I usually line up the grid lines with the top and left edge of the image. I'll then tape the top of the picture to the grid in a couple of places. This way I can lift the grid off of the image if I ever need to. Now I'm going to make a square grid on a blank sheet of paper that looks just like this one. I'm choosing to make a 1-inch grid, so each grid square is 1 inch wide by 1 inch tall. You can make a grid with larger squares or with smaller ones, but I'm personally more comfortable with working with 1-inch squares. The bigger the squares on your drawing and the smaller the squares in your reference means the bigger your drawing is going to be in relation to your reference image. I'm going to show you how to do this a couple of different ways, once using a ruler and another time without using a ruler, so that if you don't have a ruler handy, you can still make a grid using common household items. Start by lining up the ruler just below the top edge of the paper. Then line up the first measurement on the ruler with the left edge of the paper. Then hold the ruler down securely and make a mark on the paper along every inch line. This will give you even measurements for the grid lines you'll draw later. Then slide the ruler down to the bottom edge of the paper and line up the ruler along the bottom edge. It's important not to turn or flip your paper, and I'll show you why that is in a minute. Now you're going to line up the first measurement of the ruler with the left edge of the paper again, just like you did at the top. Now make another set of marks along every inch line. Next, turn the paper 90 degrees. Line up the first ruler measurement with the left edge of the paper and make marks at every inch line. If the paper is longer than the ruler, then when you've made marks to the end of the ruler, slide the ruler down the paper, line up the ruler with the marks that you've made, and continue marking until you reach the end of the paper. Slide the ruler down to the bottom of the paper and repeat, making a set of marks 1 inch apart, sliding the ruler down the paper if you need to. Now that you have a set of evenly spaced marks along all 4 edges of your paper, it's time to connect them. Starting at the top, line up the ruler just underneath the first set of marks on either side. You want to make sure that your pencil can touch the mark you've made and the ruler at the same time. Then hold the ruler down securely and draw your line lightly. Repeat this going all the way down the paper. Make sure that your ruler is lined up on both sides before drawing your lines. Now turn the paper and do the same thing for the lines going in the other direction. Now, if your ruler isn't long enough to reach the end of the paper, here's what you do. Find out which line is furthest from the edge but that your ruler can still reach. Then on that line make a new set of marks each 1 inch apart. Make sure that you line up the ruler along the left edge of the paper just like you did before. Then you can line up the marks, start drawing the line, then slide your ruler down and then complete that line. Work all the way down the paper just like before. Now you've got a complete 1 inch by 1 inch grid. Now, if you don't have a ruler, you can still make a grid with items that you may have in your house. What a ruler really is a system of measurements and a straight edge. So if you can find a substitute for a straight edge and a set of measurements, you can make a grid just the same. For a straight edge, I'm going to use this old sketchbook, and for a set of measurements, I'm going to start with a piece of scrap paper and a pencil. I'm going to start by making a single measurement on the edge of the scratch paper by making 2 marks about 1 inch apart. I'm really just guessing here, but what's important is that all of your measurements are even and consistent. Now, just like I did with the ruler, I'm going to line up one side of my measurement with the left edge of the paper and make a mark just above the other side of the measurement. Then I'm going to work my way across the paper, lining up the previous marks with the new ones. You want to make sure that you're lining up things pretty exactly here because every new mark will be based off of the last mark you put down. Now you can see here that I had a little bit of paper space left over after my last mark. That's why you never want to turn or flip the paper over to make the marks on the opposite side. If I did that and I had a full measurement on one side and not a full measurement on the other, then the lines between them would be crooked, and then all of the other lines would be crooked too. So when you measure along the bottom edge of the paper, start by lining up along the same edge that you started with when you measured the top. Once you've made marks like this on all 4 edges of your paper, you can draw your lines. If you have a straight edge, like the side of a cardboard box or a book or a thickly folded sheet of paper that can reach all the way from one side of the paper to the other, that's ideal. If you don't have a straight edge to reach all the way across the long side of the paper, you should at least have one that reaches across the short side. You can draw lines on the short side going all the way down, then find the line furthest from the edge of the paper that your straight edge can still reach. Then make a new set of marks using the measurement you started with. Then use your straight edge to draw the lines as far as they can go on one side, flip the paper over, and then fill in the lines on the other side. Before I begin my drawing, I'm going to make a tool that can really help you when using the grid method. It's called a viewfinder. You'll need some tape, some scissors, and some scrap paper to start. Cut 4 strips of scrap paper and line them up along the bottom, sides, and top of one of the grid squares of your reference image. Then tape them together. It's important that you can see all sides of your grid square through the viewfinder at the same time. A viewfinder that is too small will do you more harm than good. Now you have a tool that you can move from square to square that allows you to focus on what's going on in each square by seeing them one at a time. This can allow you to cut down on the amount of visual information your brain is taking in at one time. So if you have an image that has a lot of detail, it can keep the process of drawing it from getting overwhelming. It can also allow you to see the image as a series of shapes instead of objects, and shapes are easier for our brains to process and to draw than whole objects are. Oftentimes, if we can't tell what it is that we're seeing, we can draw it a lot easier. Remember also that the viewfinder is a tool. You don't have to use it when using the grid method, but it can make things a lot easier. In this example, I'm working with a reference photo that has a 3/4 inch grid on it, and we'll draw that image onto squares that are a little larger than 1 inch. So the whole drawing will be quite a bit bigger than the reference image when I'm done. How many squares you divide your image up into is up to you. The more squares you have on your reference picture, the more squares you have to copy, but the less detail you have to deal with in each square, and the more reference lines you have to match things up. When copying using the grid, you can work your way through row by row or by following the lines of the reference image. It's up to you. I'm going to start in the upper left corner and work my way across one square at a time, one row at a time, copying the shapes that I see. Pay special attention to how the shapes inside each square of your reference image meet up with the lines of the grid square itself. Whenever you've finished drawing a shape or a section of your drawing, you always want to double check your drawing against your reference to see if what you drew matches and fix any shapes or proportions that don't look right. Try your best to not think about the objects that you're trying to draw. Instead, think about the shapes that you see. So instead of thinking that I'm drawing a skull, my focus is going to be on the shapes that I see in each square. That's where the viewfinder helps. It prevents you from seeing the whole object in the picture, only the different shapes. It breaks things down into triangles and half circles and rectangles, shapes that are easier to see and easier to recreate. If you come to a square that has an exceptional amount of detail, one strategy is to start with dividing out the big shapes and group of shapes first. So if you see three smaller shapes in your viewfinder that together make a triangle, start by lightly drawing out that triangle into your blank square. Then break down that triangle into the separate shapes that fit within it. Blocking out big sections of the square into simple geometric shapes, then filling in the details once those big shapes look proportionate will make a world of difference when drawing and will make the process of seeing and drawing a lot easier. Another technique is to find out where some of the different shapes or key features you're seeing line up with the horizontal and vertical lines of each grid square. Sometimes I'll draw lines on top of my reference image from key points that extend all the way to the grid lines. This will give me reference points in my drawing that I can use to figure out where some of those different shapes and features should be. Above all, it's important to constantly compare your drawing to your reference and constantly ask yourself, does this look right? If it does, great, you can move on. If it doesn't, then ask yourself what is the difference between your drawing and your reference. If something is different, chances are it's in the wrong spot, it's the wrong size, or it's the wrong shape. If you drew something too big, then erase it and draw it smaller. If it's too far up and to the left, then erase it and draw it lower and more to the right. If it's the wrong shape, then try seeing how the edges would line up with the grid squares and try the blocking techniques that I mentioned. Contrary to popular belief, doing lots of drawing does not make you better at drawing. Analyzing your drawing and correcting your mistakes, that's what makes you better at drawing. Once the drawing is finished, a common question that people ask is, how do you get rid of the grid lines? One thing to think about when beginning to draw your grid lines is to draw them really lightly so that you can erase them without damaging the paper. My personal solution for getting rid of the grid lines is that I don't. Whenever I use the grid method, I draw onto a sheet of rough draft paper or sketch paper. I'll then place a sheet of final drawing paper on top and then trace the image minus the grid lines. If you have a light box, you can easily use it to trace out your image. And if you don't have a light box, then you can tape the drawing and the final paper together against a window and let the natural light be your light box. Like all drawing exercises, the grid method takes practice. The first time you try it, it might be really frustrating and you might get several things wrong. That happens and that's okay. Just keep doing it. Over time, it'll get easier and you'll find that your skills at drawing from observation are improving.